Imagine the scene. Abraham, already many years old, contemplating the stars in the night sky, in the middle of the silent desert. Time had passed, and Abraham's white hair was already a testimony of his long journey on earth. He was a man who had followed the voice of God, leaving his homeland and his family, believing in the divine promises that he would be the father of a great nation. But the years passed, and Abraham still had no children. But before we begin the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We know that it is important to pass on the word of God to you. Together we will acquire divine wisdom. It was in this moment of reflection and perhaps doubt that God appeared to him again, reaffirming his promise. Abraham, you will be the father of many nations, said the Lord. This promise undoubtedly filled Abraham's heart with hope, but it also brought with it a certain weight. He was already old, and his wife, Sarah, whom he loved so much, was unable to have children. Abraham's faith was great, but reality seemed to contradict the promise. Sarah, observing her husband's aging and the apparent delay in fulfilling the promise, began to think of a solution. It was common in those days for a woman to allow her servant to have a child in her place when she was unable to have children. So Sarah suggested to Abraham that he have a child with her Egyptian servant, Hagar. It was a practical solution, but it was also fraught with emotional and spiritual implications. Abraham, perhaps overcome by his eagerness to see God's promise fulfilled and by his trust in his wife, accepted Sarah's suggestion. He took Hagar as his concubine, and Hagar soon conceived. When Hagar discovered that she was pregnant, the dynamic between her and Sarah changed dramatically. Hagar began to feel superior because she was carrying Abraham's child, something Sarah could not do. This caused increasing tension in Abraham's household. And so Ishmael was born, Abraham's first son, blood of his blood, flesh of his flesh. Abraham, as he held Ishmael in his arms, must have felt a mix of emotions. Joy at finally having an heir, but also a shadow of uncertainty about what the future would bring. Ishmael was, in Abraham's eyes, the initial fulfillment of God's promise. Although he was not Sarah's son, he was, in fact, Abraham's son, and that could not be ignored. Ishmael, although born in difficult circumstances, was an important part of God's fulfillment of Abraham's promise. He was the beginning of something greater, an initial step in God's plan that would change the history of many nations. But, like all great stories, this one was just beginning, and the choices made at that moment would have consequences that would echo for generations. Imagine Abraham's tent, a place that should have been one of peace and security, but now filled with tension. Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian servant, had become pregnant by Abraham, and that changed everything. From being a mere servant, Hagar became the mother of the future heir, and this filled her with a new sense of importance. She began to look down on Sarah, perhaps even with a certain air of superiority, because she was carrying in her womb the son that Sarah had not been able to have. Sarah, a strong and faithful woman who had waited patiently for so many years by Abraham's side for God's promise to be fulfilled, felt humiliated and threatened. Hagar's pregnancy was not only a challenge to her role as the primary wife, but also a painful reminder of her own infertility. The servant who had once been under her command now seemed to occupy a place of prominence that did not belong to her, and this hurt her deeply. The tension between the two women grew with each passing day. Hagar's contempt did not go unnoticed, and Sarah's pain turned to anger. Overcome by this feeling, Sarah began to treat Hagar harshly, trying to reassert her authority in the household. Every harsh word, every rigorously imposed task, was a reflection of the conflict that boiled over within her. It was as if Sarah wanted to remind Hagar of her place and, at the same time, deal with her own frustration. Hagar, on the other hand, felt the weight of this severity. What had begun as a situation that she might have found advantageous quickly became untenable. Abraham's house, which should have been a place of protection, now felt like an emotional battlefield. Sarah's looks were like arrows, and her harsh words were like blows that Hagar did not know how to avoid. There came a time when Hagar could bear no more and, overcome by despair, decided to flee to the desert. The desert, a place of solitude and danger, became Hagar's refuge. She was alone, far from the safety of Abraham's tent, and unsure of what the future held for her. But in that moment of utter vulnerability, something extraordinary happened. An angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar in the wilderness. He not only found her, but brought with him a message of hope and promise. The angel told Hagar that the son she was carrying would be the father of a great nation. This must have been an unexpected relief to Hagar, for even in the midst of flight and uncertainty, God had heard the cry of her heart. The name the angel gave the boy, Ishmael, which means God hears, was living proof that the Lord was aware of her pain and suffering. This experience in the wilderness not only gave Hagar the assurance that her son had a great future, but also the courage to return. She returned to Abraham's tent, knowing that God was with her and her son. The tension in Abraham's family did not disappear, but Hagar now carried with her the promise of God, and that made all the difference. Years had passed since the birth of Ishmael, Abraham's first son with Hagar, and the scenario in Abraham's life was about to change dramatically. God, faithful to his promise, decided to establish an everlasting covenant with Abraham, a covenant that would mark the special relationship between God and Abraham's descendants. As a sign of this covenant, God commanded that Abraham and all the males of his household be circumcised, a rite that symbolized the everlasting covenant between God and his chosen people. Ishmael, who was already 13 years old at the time, was also included in this covenant. Circumcision, a practice that could be painful and frightening for a young man, was performed in obedience to God's command. Abraham, in his unshakable faith, circumcised not only himself but also his son, demonstrating his complete trust in God's plans. However, family peace was far from being achieved. Although Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn, God revealed to Abraham that his wife Sarah, even in her old age, would bear him a son. This son, Isaac, would be the true heir of the divine covenant. This news, while full of hope and joy for Abraham and Sarah, brought a shadow of worry and tension to Hagar and Ishmael. Ishmael's position as Abraham's only son, and therefore the natural heir, was suddenly threatened by the promise of a new son. Sarah, who had already struggled with feelings of jealousy and insecurity toward Hagar and Ishmael, now saw herself as the mother of the rightful heir. The promise of Isaac intensified the conflicts within Abraham's household, with Sarah perceiving Ishmael and Hagar as potential rivals. Meanwhile, Hagar, aware that her son Ishmael was losing the privileged position he had held, must have felt a mixture of fear and sadness. Ishmael, who had grown up knowing that he was the son of Abraham and would one day be the leader of a great nation, now found himself in an uncertain position. Isaac's promise. Are you enjoying the video? If these messages have touched your heart, why not subscribe to the channel? That way, you can stay up to date with all the news and not miss any words of faith and hope. It was not only a significant event for Abraham and Sarah, but also a turning point in the lives of Ishmael and Hagar, with implications that would resonate for generations. The story reaches a pivotal moment when Isaac, the promised son, is finally born. Isaac's arrival is a source of great joy for Abraham and Sarah, but at the same time, it also marks the beginning of a period of intense tension in the family. Abraham's love for Ishmael is evident, but Isaac's birth creates a new dynamic, bringing to the surface feelings of insecurity and rivalry. A few years pass, and the day arrives when Isaac is weaned. This event, in the culture of the time, was more than a simple milestone in a child's growth. It was an important celebration, indicating that the child had survived the first few years of life and was now on the path to becoming independent. Abraham organizes a big party in honor of his son, and the whole family gets together to celebrate. However, during the festivities, something happens that would change Ishmael's destiny forever. Sarah, watching from afar, sees Ishmael playing with Isaac. What could have been a simple moment of fun between siblings is interpreted by Sarah as a threat. She sees Ishmael's laughter and jokes as a sign that he might try to usurp Isaac's place as Abraham's heir. With a heart full of fear and resentment, Sarah makes a drastic decision. Sarah goes to Abraham and demands that he expel Hagar and Ishmael from their home. For her, there was no room for the two children to grow up together, especially because she believed that Ishmael could be a negative influence on Isaac or even a competitor for the legacy promised by God. Abraham, although deeply distressed, hesitates to respond to Sarah's request. He loves Ishmael and doesn't want to see him leave, much less to an uncertain destination in the desert. But then God intervenes. He speaks to Abraham and reassures him, saying that although Isaac is the heir of the divine promise, Ishmael will not be forgotten. God promises that Ishmael will also be the father of a great nation. With this assurance, Abraham, although with a heavy heart, decides to follow God's guidance. The next morning, Abraham says goodbye to Hagar and Ishmael. He gives them some bread and a bowl of water and sends them away, leaving them to the mercy of the desert of Beersheba. The scenario is bleak and distressing. Hagar, carrying the burden of being a single mother, and Ishmael, a young man in his teens, are left to face an uncertain future. Traversing the hot, arid sands, they face the harsh realities of exile and survival in the desert. In the arid desert of Beersheba, Hagar and Ishmael faced the relentless heat of the sun. The water that Abraham had given them was almost gone, and despair began to take hold. Hagar, an anguished mother, saw her son weakening with each step, without strength, and the sound of his groans cut through her like a blade. She had already gone through so much pain and suffering, but now, it seemed that the final fate of both was sealed. In a moment of deep distress, Hagar decided to place Ishmael under the shade of a bush, unable to bear the sight of her son dying before her eyes. She walked away, sitting some distance away, and wept bitterly. Her heart was broken, and her tears mingled with the desert dust. The solitude of the desert seemed to echo her lamentations. But in that desolate silence, something extraordinary happened. Suddenly, God heard Ishmael's cry. The boy's cry, however weak, reached the heavens. And then an angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar. His words, full of compassion and authority, echoed in the desert. "Do not be afraid, Hagar, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, pick up the lad and take him by the hand, for I will make him a great nation." With these words, hope was reborn in Hagar's heart. The angel showed her a well of water that she had not seen before. It was as if, in the midst of the aridity of the desert, God had caused a spring of life to spring up. She ran to the well, filled the water skin, and gave Ishmael a drink, and saw his strength slowly return. God's provision in the desert was not only physical, but also spiritual. God reaffirmed his promise to Hagar, reminding her that, although Ishmael was not the heir of the direct covenant, he was not forgotten. Ishmael also had a purpose, a promise, and a nation that would arise from him. God, in his infinite mercy, showed that his care extended to everyone, even those who seemed to be on the margins of history. That moment of rescue in the wilderness marked the lives of Hagar and Ishmael forever. They were not just surviving, they were living under God's promise. And so, with new strength and renewed faith, they continued their journey, knowing that wherever they went, God's protecting hand would be with them. Ishmael, the boy whose cry echoed in the desert and was heard by God, grew up amid the scorching heat and vast inhospitable environment. When Hagar, his mother, wandered through the desert with young Ishmael, believing they were destined to die, God intervened in an extraordinary way. Hagar's despair and Ishmael's cry reached the heavens, and an angel of the Lord appeared, showing them a well of water. This divine intervention not only saved their lives but also marked Ishmael with the certainty that God was with him, even in the most extreme situations. The desert, for many a place of desolation and despair, became Ishmael's home, where he developed unparalleled skills and strength. From an early age, Ishmael realized that to survive in that hostile environment, he needed to be strong, resilient, and, above all, determined. The relentless sun, the cold nights, and the seemingly endless stretches of sand were his first teachers, shaping his character and transforming him into a young man of unshakable courage. With every step he took, Ishmael felt the weight of God's promise on his life, a promise that drove him not only to survive but to thrive in that challenging environment. From a very young age, Ishmael showed a special talent with the bow and arrow. While other boys might have played or occupied themselves with lighter activities, Ishmael spent hours observing the subtle movements of nature around him. He learned to identify the signs of danger, to anticipate the movements of animals, and to use the bow with a precision that few could match. The hard training, often carried out under the scorching sun, forged in Ishmael a unique skill. Over time, he became not only a skilled hunter but an exceptional archer, famous for his accuracy and prowess. Life in the desert required more than just physical strength. It demanded intelligence, adaptability, and a deep connection with the environment. Ishmael mastered these arts with expertise, learning to find water in unlikely places, to build shelters with the limited resources the desert offered, and to navigate by the stars during the dark nights. His reputation as an archer and leader grew, and he came to be respected and admired not only for his strength but for his wisdom. To the other inhabitants of the desert, Ishmael became an example of how adversity can shape an individual into someone of great value. As Ishmael matured, so did his desire to establish his own family. In the desert, he found an Egyptian woman, a wife who shared his strength and resilience. She was someone who understood the hardships of desert life, who knew what it took to survive and thrive there. This union represented more than just a marital bond. It was the beginning of the fulfillment of the divine promise made to Abraham and Hagar. God had promised that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation, and this marriage was the first step toward the realization of that promise. Together, Ishmael and his wife began a new lineage, and over the years, the couple was blessed with 12 sons. These sons, raised in the same challenging environment that shaped Ishmael, grew up strong and determined. Each of them inherited the courage, skill, and resilient spirit of their father. As Ishmael's sons matured, they became leaders of their own tribes, spreading throughout the desert and beyond, forming the 12 Ishmaelite nations. These nations, direct descendants of Ishmael, became powerful and influential, shaping the history of the region for generations. The growth of the Ishmaelite nations was not just a reflection of Ishmael's abilities as a leader and warrior, but also a clear proof of God's faithfulness to his promise. Every tribe that emerged was a living testimony of divine intervention in the lives of Hagar and Ishmael, and of how God can turn what seems to be a desert of despair into a source of life and prosperity. Even outside the direct line of the covenant, Ishmael and his descendants played a significant role in the divine plan. The 12 Ishmaelite tribes not only thrived but also had a lasting impact on the history of the Middle East, influencing cultures, economies, and politics for generations. They were a powerful reminder that the reach of divine providence goes beyond human boundaries, embracing all of Abraham's descendants. This story of Ishmael, from a boy who cried in the desert to a leader of nations, is a testimony of God's grace and faithfulness. It shows us that even in the most difficult situations, God is present, hearing our cries and guiding our steps. Ishmael was not just a survivor. He was a conqueror, a leader, and an example of how God can use anyone, in any circumstance, to fulfill his divine purposes. His life, marked by the desert, by adversity, and by the fulfilled promise, continues to inspire and teach generations about the transformative power of faith and perseverance. Despite the tensions and separations of the past, the end of Abraham's life brought a moment of reconciliation and reflection among his sons. Abraham, the patriarch whose life had been marked by challenges and promises, was now on the verge of his departure. His death was a significant event, bringing family and friends together for a final tribute. Isaac, Abraham's legitimate son and heir to the divine promise, had followed his father's path with faith and devotion. Ishmael, Abraham's son with Hagar, had lived his own journey, a journey that, although distant, was also part of God's plan. The moment of Abraham's death served as a meeting point for the two brothers, each with his own story and legacy, but both linked by their father and the divine promises. Abraham's burial was a solemn and significant event. Isaac and Ishmael, now mature men, were present to pay their last respects to the father they had both loved, but in different ways. The tensions and disagreements of the past gave way to a moment of unity and respect. With a sense of maturity and understanding, Ishmael and Isaac found common ground around their father's grave. The act of burying Abraham became a symbol of reconciliation and family continuity, honoring the memory of the patriarch who had been instrumental in shaping their lives. Ishmael, who had lived for 137 years, was remembered with respect and recognition. His life in the desert and his accomplishments as patriarch of the 12 Ishmaelite tribes were widely recognized. He was not only a member of Abraham's family, but also a leader of a great nation whose descendants spread across vast regions. His legacy was vast, and he was considered an important ancestor to the Arab peoples, who saw in him a symbol of strength, resilience, and leadership. Ishmael's impact extended beyond his own generation, leaving an indelible mark on human history. He had fulfilled God's promise to become a great nation and had lived a life of courage and dignity. Although their path was different from Isaac's, both brothers recognized the importance and value of the legacy Abraham had left them. Ishmael, with his name now etched in the history and memory of the nations, was remembered as a respected patriarch, a strong leader, and a man whose life had been deeply intertwined with divine history. His story was a testament to how God's plans unfold in ways that transcend human divisions and tensions, showing the beauty of reconciliation and the power of a lasting legacy. Thus, as we reflect on Ishmael's life, we see that he not only survived but thrived, fulfilling God's promises and leaving a legacy that continues to influence and inspire generations to this day.